So today's first speaker is going to be Professor Gregory Möller. He will talk about project cycles versus market volatility, a structural contrast of transatlantic higher ed funding architectures. Professor Möller is a professor of environmental chemistry and toxicology at the University of Idaho, serving in both the Department of Soil and Water Systems and the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering. He has been with the university for 36 years, following his time at the University of California, Davis. Professor Möller teaches courses in sustainability and toxicology, has served at all levels of faculty governance, and has led several initiatives exploring the future of higher education. Among his many honors, he's a Fulbright Fellow, a Fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Inventors, a laureate of the Harrison Prescott Eddy Research Medal for the Water Environment Federation, and a recipient of the National Excellence in Teaching Award from the U.S. Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. His research, supported by approximately $12 million in competitive grants, has resulted in over 60 peer-reviewed scientific publications. Furthermore, Professor Möller holds 7 utility patents for commercialized water treatment technologies. Today, these innovations clean billions of liters of water daily across 3 continents, empowering millions of people to leave a softer footprint on the planet. So we're very excited to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome to you all. Again, my name is Greg Möller, and thank you for a wonderful introduction, and thank you to the University of León for hosting this wonderful event. One thing that I need to introduce before we get started is the fact that my graduate student here, Corey Martinetti, has been actually studying EURECA-PRO as his thesis project. So you are our research project, and so we have been watching you, looking at you, participating online and in present, looking at EURECA-PRO doing some very, very interesting and challenging work that's going to line us up for a better future. But with that, today we're going to talk about the differences and some of the constraints to sustainability, and that's financial sustainability. And we're going to do what's called a structured comparison. A structured comparison is an approach to compare things that are 2 fundamentally different things, apples and oranges, if you will. We're not saying one is better than the other, but it's a comparison technique that allows us to learn from each other, the good things and the bad, and some of those challenges. So as we look at it, we're going to talk about funding structures, because that's one of the particular challenges for EURECA-PRO and for the United States as well. There's threats to higher education globally, as we all know, especially with respect to finances and competing use of available public funds. And so we're talking mostly about publicly funded higher education and typically the 4-year research university. So temporal governance, our funding actually dictates how we govern things. So if we have long-term unstructured finances, we tend to look far on the horizon. It's called the art of the long view. We can look at societal problems in terms of their temporal distance rather than managing projects to 2-year cycles, 4-year cycles, like I do in my research projects that are funded. And it's interesting to hear that some of the faculty here that are leadership capacity for EURECA-PRO have been essentially sequestered, that EURECA-PRO is not a program, but a project. It's a faculty project. And I would submit to you that it's much larger than that. It is the change of the future that is drastically needed. So we do have, with these compressed funding cycles, we get temporal compression. So we have to start believing that we can't do these long involved projects. We can't change curriculum. We can't change degree tracks, because who knows where the funding will be when we actually get the administrative work done, the academic work done, to do those programs, develop those courses. The architecture problem is a real problem for us. And so we need to establish in all of what we do the funding, the basic funding that gives us the ability to dream, to imagine, to develop, to create, because the future of our students. And one thing I like to always make clear with my faculty fellows and to the students themselves, what do we do as universities? What do we teach? First and foremost, we teach our students hope for the future. So this is a structural comparison of United States over in the blue, and in the pink and gray over here, the EURECA-PRO, or the European Union approach to education. and especially when you talk about alliances. Now, we do have quite a few alliances in the United States, but they're far more independence. We preach independence, our funding is independent, and especially in public universities, which are typically state-driven. 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln decided that the public, he established the A&M universities. You probably have heard of Texas A&M, and these land-grant university systems are publicly funded institutions, and in fact, he funded them with land grants, gave us hundreds of thousands of acres in our own little territories to support the future of higher education for the common folk, not just the wealthy. And so we'll go through this a little bit, but in the United States, we have federal grants, state appropriations, we have tuition and fees, we have private philanthropy and endowments. It's a big change. But you can see that we have an institutional core amount of funding that comes in on a program basis, year to year, changing perhaps by the legislature and what they decide is going to be a tax cut or not. And we also have a substantially large discretionary reserve. And that's substantial even for instance, my university. I'm joint faculty in Washington State University and University of Idaho. And we have, I think, in a discretionary reserve and foundation monies, something on the order of $500 million in cash or investments, and another $500 million, so closing in on $1 billion for a small university by US standards of 12,000 people. And the rest is in land, primarily land from the land grants 150 years ago. And that's appropriate to our size and our cost basis because we pay for a lot of things as a university that European institutions do not. So our annual operating budget is more like about $500 million than, for instance, León here at about 150,000 euros or so. And that's because we have to pay for healthcare, we have to pay for some insurance or investment for Social Security or retirement, and some other operating costs in terms of our infrastructure. So we do have this institutional core to manage some of that, but we also rely on tuition, which is a big difference between US and EU. Over on the EU side, we see that for alliances, when you partner up, there's a substantial amount of cooperation, but there's also a substantial amount of barriers, and we'll talk a little bit mostly about what's called cross-border philanthropy, which is relatively non-existent. Philanthropy is a different animal in the European Union than it is in the United States, a different culture. Has a lot to do with long-held views about the relationship of the state and education. We're not going to get into those details, but it is different. And we're doing a structural contrast, and we just want to note those differences. But it makes it a little bit more difficult because one of the things that we have in the US in this discretionary reserve is flexibility. We have a bank account out there that if we want to attract a very accomplished professor, we can endow that position out of the discretionary reserve. And so that gives us flexibility. If we need to build a laboratory to support a new employee, that reserve helps us develop that. So that having that flexible spending account, if you will, is a very powerful thing for United States public universities. So this is what our landscape is currently looking at, and I want you to notice this is fiscal year 25. So this report just came out this year, but it tracks last year's fiscal health. And you see some green arrows going up, that things like the funding levels are pretty much have peaked, they've come back up. Investment growth has grown. Enrollment has recovered from some of the lows that we have seen. But on the downside, we're seeing more fiscal constraints. We still have about half the states in the United States that are suffering in terms of funding, very, very low level funding. We have state level variance in terms of gains and losses. But the biggest thing in the United States, and it's happening in Europe as well, is what's called the demographic cliff. And we have a 15-year impending cycle, downward cycle of traditional students. And therefore, the United States and also in Europe, we're looking at establishing programs, mini credentials or other sorts of degree programs for non-traditional students. Now, my master's student I had introduced as a co-author to this study is a non-traditional student. He spent 20 years in high finance, ultra-wealthy banking. He's got a master's degree in finance and a bachelor's degree in finance. He and his wife traveled enough to know that they had achieved something in life, a little bit of financial independence, but also wanted to give back to nature. So he left that career, took on a master's degree in environmental science, and is actually now transferred his job. He's the fiscal coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy. They raise about $16 million a year in public and private philanthropy. So these are the sorts of students that we are talking about in terms of the future demographics of higher education. So in the EU, the paradigm shift is towards deep transnational integration. You'll see more of that in the following presentation with some new data that's been happening actually within the last month, very positive data for transnational integration of higher education in Europe. Some of those boundaries are at least being talked about, and resolutions and even funding for transitions is happening in real time. But part of the problem that we have identified in our research, and we've been reporting back to the board here at EURECA-PRO and looking at it for ourselves, and so that you know, when we do research, we read your reports. And one thing about EURECA-PRO and a lot of the other sorts of commissions and higher education commissions in Europe, there are a lot of publicly funded and publicly available reports. And that's a good thing, but also it can be a bad thing in terms of the amount of reporting that is needed for these short-term grants. We are looking at the case of EURECA-PRO, and there is a lot of challenge with aligning the bureaucracy in terms of all of the details that you have to exist, crossing all of those multinational borders, all the cultures, all the tax laws, all the cultural governance things that are associated with what is associated with just the EU, that mostly everybody in this audience, from students to above, is an expert on, far greater than ourselves. But we have some challenges in these transnational European universities. There is an indirect burden cost, the cost of participation to accommodate these new students, these new infrastructures, to open our doors. Quite often in European universities, the classrooms are saturated. There is no room for growth, and there's certainly not necessarily room for budgetary increases in many of the universities. And we're talking about member states here in the EU that some are very large and perhaps wealthier or more economically available in terms of supporting these kind of programs, and some that are a little bit more stretched for that. So that divergence of funding availability allows for a differentiation of ability to participate as a whole and full partner. The risks are greater because of that. So here I'm going to get to the meat of my presentation, which is focusing on the US. And so we do have what is called this hybrid approach. And you saw in the big block of blue this foundation or this reserve that we have. And that hybrid approach of getting state government, but also having this nut of funding that is flexible and established internally and controlled internally. There's what do you call it, oversight, if you will, by governance bodies. But there is a lot of flexibility to achieve those goals, those programmatic long-term planning goals within the institution itself. And so we have that. We are guided quite often in public universities by what's called the APLU, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And so you talk about trans-European alliances. This is our alliance, if you will. They work Washington, D.C. for sure in terms of lobbying and trying to get appropriations for many federal programs, not only for the base Department of Education grants and loans, but also for research through many of the research agencies across the United States. So we have that challenge as well, and we bring that together in terms of having a single voice through APLU. And I think there's 238 participating institutions of higher education with APLU, and all of the land-grant universities. And each state has its own land-grant university. For instance, University of California at Berkeley, a prestige university for sure in terms of its academic accomplishment, was founded as a land-grant university. Land-grant meaning A&M, agricultural and mechanical arts, military as well, back again 150 years ago. So the thing that it has really given us to have these discretionary buffers is to have this autonomous control of money. So in other words, it was the people on the inside that are closest to the challenges of teaching, educating, establishing world-class research, had the ability to address funding needs closest to the need. Okay, so there wasn't this external sorts of view of rotating officials, perhaps public officials, or I'm sorry, political officials. It was educational professionals, and we'll talk about that change. So, because it is changing. Right now, I talk about the collapse, and here we'll get a little bit to the current events you're all aware of in the United States. It is a collapsing system, this hybrid system. It's something that we as academics have not been prepared for. Politicians were always in favor of education, and now in many regards, higher education especially is regarded as public enemy number one for some odd political reason. So that we have this market volatility right now in terms of political pressure. The hybrid model is under attack. You may have heard of this bill that passed this past year, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBA as it's called. There's many other ways that people in the United States call that, but the biggest impacts are some of the cuts to public funding. Medicare, which is, Medicaid, which essentially is health programming for the lowest tier, economic tier of individuals. It was cut $1 trillion over the next 10 years. That's massive because those needs do not disappear. As you well know, we have a very different and quite expensive healthcare system in the United States. So the problem is, without that need disappearing, those individuals will show up at hospitals and emergency rooms with deep disease, and it still costs the public, but through other means. The other thing is that there's a federal research starvation. Research has lost its ability to say we have value with some political leadership. And there have been proposed 52% cuts to the National Science Foundation. That has actually been modulated back down, but still talking about incredibly large cuts. On an annual average, that's about $10 billion a year in just that one funding agency, and that's a substantial cut, as you can imagine. So what happens? What happens is we have these federal law action, this One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and the reason those cuts happened is to give tax credits and tax reductions across the board, and perhaps to many of the wealthier sectors that thought they were being overtaxed. So that's a very large-scale problem. But the state budget impacts are real because without that federal funding, those state Medicaid funding has to go up. Somebody has to cover those individuals, and they start looking for discretionary funding. So right now, state funding to public higher education is being cut indiscriminately. Our home institution here, we suffered about a 3% cut last year, actually, and another 5% this year. Those are substantial amounts of money, and in the millions of dollars, and it is mostly politics. It's not for cause, it's not for performance, it's because. And because we need to lower the cost of governance, I guess is the best way to describe it. So those severe cuts are impacting us. There's drastic reduction to some of these proposed higher education funding. Some states worse off than others, for sure. And the outcomes are going to be increased tuition reliance for students, which is going to price out the lower economic classes in the United States, program cuts, and reduced research capacity. So, in a sense, we're getting penalized for this financial autonomy that we have had. They're started to weaponize the buffer. They're now starting to increase, or actually initiate new excise taxes up to 8% on any sort of benefit that comes to the university on an annual basis. So now this money that used to be for a charity, a university is a charity, it's a philanthropy target in the United States, and now they're taxing that resource to have more control, because I think it's about political control more than anything else. So we have this erosion of liquidity as well. One of the biggest and most drastic impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is the cuts to student loan programs, especially the grad PLUS is parent loans to undergraduate students. It's a key for everyone that is sending their kid to college in the United States, except perhaps for the wealthy. And these are just loans, but they're reduced rate loans. So it's not market level, it's usually a point or two below market level. And they're critical for middle-class families to, especially with multiple children, to send their kids to college. So it's going to have an impact, and actually of just last week, that was fully enacted. So it's a problem. So we get back to the transatlantic synthesis and some of the strategic design challenges that we have. There's a bureaucratic rigidity that you all are faced with in the European Union in terms of academic programs. From what we have studied and the reports that we've said, especially with the short timelines and the amount of indirect or overhead expenses for report writing, reporting on an annual basis, a programmatic basis, rewriting. I was sitting in a program earlier this morning where they were talking about the inability to actually have the resources to apply for some of these transition funds and these trans-European PhD program initiatives that are currently out there, because those undertakings are substantial in terms of the administrative expense. So we're suffering from an acute shock. We are facing now political exposure. We are not used to being public enemy number one in education, so that's a new culture that we're having to realize. And you know, our buffer has been weaponized against us, and that's not good either. So the path forward for all of us is establishing multi-annual secure funding, so that the project type timeline, the process timeline, the long term, the long view is achievable through this structured finance. So we have both of those similar concerns in both the EU and the US. So what we have now is the future of the transatlantic and what we can learn as lessons. Our US trajectory is a dear one. I'm not going to shield us. We have seen in the short term some drastic changes that map out, at least for the near-term future, some real challenges to what we're doing, some disruptions. I'll tell you a story about my own research program's disruption. I have a student from the Navajo Nation. She's a tribal student. Just so that you know, the Navajo Nation in the United States is about 3 times the size of Belgium, and it's a large landmass with a chronically impoverished population. My student won a tribal NSF PhD scholarship worth $250,000 to fund her PhD work. She was 1 year into that program when the NSF cut the program totally. And so here's a student that saw promise, saw hope, did the hard work of learning, and now essentially has had the chair pulled out from underneath her. So these changes are not just numbers in a spreadsheet, they're real and they affect people. So the hybrid warning for us is we're going to have to learn to establish our value prospectus better to people, and especially voters, to talk to the politicians. We have to get out there, as I think EURECA-PRO has to do, to get out there and establish a solid value prospectus for why what we're doing is good, how it serves society, how it serves the communities that we serve. The implications is for the EU alliances is the US model is not a European model. You have successes all your own. You have many superpowers. Sustainability is one of them. I think your sense of community, and what I see here at the universities within the EURECA-PRO program that I visited, sends a positive message that I am translating back to my campus. And I can tell you that it's even established what I call transatlantic partnerships. My president of my university and our research vice presidents and several deans were on a conference call with the rector at TUC talking about establishing partnerships. If we break down partnerships, whether it be international across Europe or internationals across the transatlantic barriers, we let those people win, if you will. So we have our work cut out for us. Yes, and so we have our work cut out for us. And with that, I'm going to say, once again, thank you for all the hard work that you're doing as a EURECA-PRO. There's certain one of us, especially my graduate student, that really is celebrating your accomplishments, and we look forward to great things coming out of this alliance. Thank you so very much.